I'm Champa Patel. I'm head of the Asia program at Chatham House, and we're joined today by our speaker, Abbas Faiz, who's an independent analyst on the Maldives and Bangladesh, and a former South Asia researcher with Amnesty International. So before we start the webinar, just to let you know, the event is on the record and that there's a chat function in the bottom left corner of your screens. This is where you can submit your questions by typing them, and we'll try and bring in as many questions as possible. In order to kick things off, this webinar is going to explore the causes of the Maldives crisis and what's likely to happen next. We're going to assess the global dimensions of the situation, and in particular, how it could impact geopolitical tensions between China and India, who are both heavily involved in the country. So I'm going to hand over to Abbas now, who's going to speak about the situation, and then we'll bring in your questions. Abbas?
Thank you, Champa. I would really like to thank you especially for inviting me. I worked with you when you were heading the Asia department at Amnesty, and I have very fond memories of that. And also thank you to you, Imogen, for organizing this webinar. What President Yameen of Maldives has been doing may look like a political farce, but he's enforcing his self-serving perceptions about his role with brutal force. This brutality is evident in police attacks against those legally protesting Yameen's excesses, beating of people at the time of their arrest, targeting reporters and journalists who are covering the protests. One of these journalists, a Raja TV journalist, was beaten so badly just a few days ago that he had to leave for Sri Lanka for medical treatment. Other journalists said police went to the airport to stop him, but fortunately he had already boarded the plane. He was not even a detainee. Why should the police want to stop him from receiving medical treatment? Perhaps because it would show the extent of the injuries and the brutality that the police is meting out on demonstrators and journalists in the Maldives. Civil society activists say that at least 27 people were arrested for what the police termed as illegal demonstrations after the imposition of the state of emergency. That may sound like a small number, but it would be equivalent roughly to 1,700 arrests in London during peaceful demonstrations. So that gives you a scale of what is happening in the Maldives. Yameen has on numerous occasions showed himself to be above the law, but has presented himself as working within the legal system, even when the evidence has distinctly suggested otherwise. He has openly breached the Constitution, but has still called it lawful. Before the recent events, he kept saying that the judicial system in the Maldives was independent. Under that pretext, he did nothing to stop the grossly unfair trial and imprisonment of his opponents. Of course, he did nothing because he wanted them to be in prison, and the Supreme Court was definitely obliging. The assistance the Supreme Court was extending to Yameen began at the time of 2013 elections, presidential elections, when the Supreme Court unilaterally amended the Constitution and the election. It annulled the first round based solely on a secret report that it never made public, and postponed the elections because Yameen wanted more time to campaign. Before the current events, I sent out a tweet, which I will read to you just now, because it summarizes what was happening before the Supreme Court statement and ruling. Constitution hijacked, elections engineered, MPs barred from their elected seats, opposition leaders jailed or to be so, ill prisoners denied treatment, trials, a sham, all blessed by judges. Did anyone explain the importance of impartiality to Maldives judges when they trained in law? That was really how things were then. In a surprise move, the Supreme Court judges came out with a surprise ruling on the 1st of February. You will know about this, most of you, but briefly, It reversed the Supreme Court's rulings on two cases. Previously, the Supreme Court had endorsed the imprisonment of almost all political leaders, even though different authorities had explained to the court that the trials were grossly unfair, internal authorities and external authorities. Amnesty, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the International Commission of Jurists, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and many others. At that time, the Supreme Court defied all these concerns, but now, on the 1st of February, they agreed and ordered the release of the detainees. Another case was that previously the Supreme Court had ruled that MPs crossing the floor of the House should lose their seats, and they did. 12 of them lost their seats. Now the Supreme Court said they should be reinstated. At first, Yameen said that he would abide by the Supreme Court ruling, but of course he did not. It was one of the two tricks he had kept for a rainy day. So the first one was the imposition of a state of emergency. I shall refer to the other one in a few minutes. Yameen arrested the Chief Justice Abdulla Saeed, Justice Hameed, the Registrar of the Supreme Court. He also arrested his half-brother and former President Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, together with two of Maumoon's sons, his nephews, of course. He got the remaining three judges of the Supreme Court to reverse their 1st February judgment. Remember that the 1st February judgment was a unanimous judgment. So those three Supreme Court judges who actually reversed the judgment were the people who had unanimously were part of that unanimous bench who actually passed the judgment of the 1st of February. So it was clear that they had been coerced to reverse the judgment. This was an open meddling in the affairs of the judiciary, but Yameen typically said it wasn't. His explanation for not releasing political prisoners was also very interesting and revealing. He said some of the prisoners had been convicted of terrorism. He was referring to the trial and imprisonment of former President Mohammed Nasheed on the allegation that he had ordered the detention of a lower court judge in 2012. An outdated law calls any such act as terrorism in the Maldives. And Yameen got Nasheed sentenced in a sham trial to 11 years under that law. Yameen called that terrorism. By that token, his own order to arrest the Chief Justice and another Supreme Court judge should be terrorism times 2. But he says his is within the law. And of course, we know that it is not. You may wonder why Yameen is so determined to subjugate an independent institution like the judiciary. It is not, of course, just the Supreme Court, but other independent bodies have also been subjugated, such as the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Human Rights Commission, the Election Commission, the Attorney General, the Judicial Services Commission, the police force, and the military, and you name it. These all show a distinct bias towards Yameen because they have been severely politicized. His deeds are no different from other autocrats except in one sense. Most of them target their opponents and reward their allies, not President Yameen. He targeted his opponents and his allies at the same time. Here is another tweet which I sent out a week or so ago, which I think will summarize that. And it goes like this. A brief history of the Maldives. There was a president who did not like his opponents, arrested them. Then he did not like his allies, arrested them. Then he did not like his nephews and brother, arrested them. The judges said, release them. He arrested the judges. That explains what has been happening. Apart from Nasheed and other political leaders who are now in detention, yeah. Um, yeah, I've got another 3 minutes. Apart from Nasheed and all the other political leaders who are now in detention were the very allies who put their weight behind Yameen. So he would become president. Their reward, imprisonment, harassment of their family members.
Apologies, I'd left myself on mute. Abbas, maybe if we could kick off the questions. So Ellie Groves is asking, what do you foresee for China and India's involvement? There's been a lot of news coverage, particularly on the Indian side, and there's two schools of thought. One saying that India should get, more proactively involved, and others saying that they should stay out of what is essentially, in their view, a domestic matter. What do you think is the role for India or China here?
Uh, I think this is a very interesting question, and to answer that, we've got to actually deal with a number of issues within the Maldives. So we've got to start by what comes under the issue of corruption, by what comes under the issue of bilateral talks, bilateral relations between the two countries. So let me just start by talking about corruption a little bit, if I may. Uh, and it has been escalating in the Maldives, something that even President Yameen has acknowledged. But of course, he always blames others for it. Yet some of the laws that he has amended are shedding a different light onto the issue. I would like to actually describe all of this because it has something to do with China. One of these amended laws regulates the sale of islands. There are some 1,200 islands, of which some 200 are habitable, comprising about 80 to 90 islands, which are set aside exclusively as holiday resorts. And the rest, including the capital Male, are where the Maldivians actually live. Up until July 2015, the sale of islands to foreigners was forbidden. This is understandable because an island in the Maldives is not like a small piece of land. It is integral to the entire territorial integrity of the country. Nonetheless, the sale of islands to foreigners was legalized. But that was not the end of the story. The law allows for the sale of an island without a bid, which is a very unusual thing. So that gave Mr. Yameen and his government the freedom to sell to whoever they wanted and at the price that they themselves only determined, provided this is the provision that the payment is made in one lump sum and in full. So now, who were the buyers? China, of course. And who else was planning to buy? Saudi Arabia. Now, with that introduction, I would like to actually go back to the issue that you were just mentioning now. Much has been said about the rivalry between China and India. I'm going to actually look at this in the context of the Maldives. Neither of them is great news to the Maldives civil society, neither of these two countries. The two countries' regional concerns are not to support democracy and human rights in that sense, but how to stop each other from gaining the upper hand. Having said that, I'd like to explain that India is a democracy with a strong civil society. It has a vibrant media that can, at the very least, question the inaction of the government towards a country like the Maldives. So, if the Indian state is not a huge promise to the Maldivians' campaign for democracy, it is not at least a threat. China, on the other hand, is a threat to the democratic processes, not just in the Maldives, but in many other parts of the world. China, being a dictatorship, itself will not, China is itself, of course, a dictatorship. And being a dictatorship will not only support local dictators, but even groom them. It is easier for China to cut a business deal with someone accountable to nobody else. And of course, President Yameen has proved to be a very strong candidate there. I hope I've answered that question.
Abbas, maybe perhaps if we could expand, how likely do you think? So Adwait Pandit is asking, how likely is it that India will actually intervene, other than diplomatic moves? And then Marco is asking on the Chinese side, do you think they're looking to build a naval base in the Maldives?
Yeah. How likely is that India will intervene? I don't think that India will actually intervene. And that is not because India will not want to do that, but because China will not want India to intervene. And it is not just a question of China putting up a barrier against that. I think the way China works, and I was reading an article in the ANI today, which is an interesting article about China, and it was saying that China wants to interfere in the affairs of other countries as much as it can, but it wants to show that it does not do that. So I think at the end, enable a situation where India will not want to interfere. And that is the reason why I was saying that neither of these two countries are actually great promises to the project of campaign for democracy and human rights in the Maldives. I believe that what will happen in the end between China and India is exactly what is happening in Bangladesh, that both countries have some kind of influence, some kind of inroads into the situation, both economically involved as well as probably India more politically involved as well. But there is a sense of coexistence. Uh, can I could you repeat the second sentence, the second question for me?
One of the questions was from Marco, who was asking, do you think China's looking to build a naval base in the Maldives?
Uh, of course, yeah, they will do that. But there is a problem with China in the Maldives because I actually wanted to cover this in more details. I think it's not going to actually. I mean, the question that really matters here is whether the state of emergency is something that China has sponsored. And I don't believe that China has sponsored the state of emergency, the imposition of the state of emergency in the Maldives. Will China want to build a naval base in the Maldives? Of course they will. And and they've bought, many islands, and they've bought these islands. I mean, the whole process of really legalizing the sale of islands and selling islands without a bid has been a process, an agreement between China and uh, and uh, and the Maldives to so that they could sell the islands. And the way that they are selling these islands, I don't know if we can actually show some of the islands to the people who are listening to us. Um, the way that they are selling these islands is very interesting because, as I said, there are 200 habitable islands, but we've got something like 1,000 uh, islands, which are not all of them habitable, or just a piece of land coming out of the water. So what is happening is that China is doing what is called reclaiming islands, which means that the lagoon is being filled with sand and other stuff, so that after a while you get I think you can see some of the pictures, and those are islands. As you can see, uh, around the land, there is an area of beautiful green water. I don't know if you can see all of that. And that is like the lagoon. So that area of beautiful green water is being filled with sand so that the entire island actually is reclaimed. Now, the the information that we get from unofficial sources is that many islands like that have been sold to China at very low prices because President Yamin can decide what price to sell them. Uh, at least five of them are definitely clear and known, and very interestingly, um, uh, China for the first time, uncharacteristically, unusually, which is because it is not China's way to come out and make comments about something, they have come out and said that no, we are not actually going to take over these islands. But that's not the case. The case is that China is trying to find an inroad into the Indian Ocean. And of course, they will want to really, do that. I mean, the Chinese naval force visited Maldives recently, and at present, from the information that I've seen, is public information, of course, is that that there is a China naval ship um, actually, moving around the area. So, so there's definitely a wish to do that.
Thank you, Abbas. I just want to bring in two related questions from Linda Bedford and Nicholas Nugent, which are asking, one, on the one hand, what's been the reaction to Yameen's moves at the moment within the Maldives? Do you think he has a large base of support? But Nicholas's question also, I think, is the flip side of that. What is the role for Nasheed here, and is he likely to return?
Uh, yeah, I'll start again. I was on mute, sorry. I think the state of emergency has actually uh, isolated President Yameen immensely. It has, because, we are talking about a president who has not just targeted his opponents, he has also targeted his allies and, all of the people who are in detention. For example, former defense minister, Colonel Nazim, who is now in detention on prompt-up charges. He was an ally of President Amin. Many other people, I mean, his brother was an ally of him, a lot of other people. So, I mean, he has actually isolated himself internally, and he has isolated himself, he's isolating himself internationally. And I think that dimension of the international isolation is going to also have an impact on China's, relationship with Yamin, and we can cover that in a, later on. But the role that whether what kind of support Yamin has. So, Yamin has the support of the military because he has politicized the military immensely when he imprisoned the defense minister. After that, there were purges in the military, and the entire military is now in the pocket of Yamin. So he can probably, kind of rely on that. I mentioned earlier that Yamin had two options to use in order to keep himself in power. One was the state of emergency. Now, this state of emergency was itself illegal when it was declared. It has been extended. It was extended yesterday, and again, it is against the constitution. One of the tricks that he has played, but he has another trick, and that is really what everybody is worried about, because there is widespread um, kind of agreement that he is actually keeping some gangs, and these are fearsome people, and if they are set loose in the streets of Mali, they can wreak havoc, and that is another, coming. That would be really the very last kind of card that Yamin is going to play. On the issue of really support within the parliament, that is very volatile, because people are under pressure, and those who are supporting him are probably under huge amount of pressure. So what is the role of Nasheed? Nasheed is a concept. Nasheed is not actually just a person. The Nasheed embodies everything that really the Maldivians are talking about in terms of democracy and in terms of human rights. Whether he is living up to that, kind of, expectation, that's another issue. But the very fact that he's there is a very important dimension of the entire process.
If I could just expand that then to look beyond sort of countries in the region. Olivia is asking, do you think the US has any kind of influence over this situation? They've called for the emergency to end, but how effective do you think the US could be in this situation? And then following on from that, David Hardingan's question, which is, do you think sanctions could be effective? And if so, what type of sanctions should be considered given what's happening in the country?
Excellent. I think I'll answer David's question first, because I think sanctions are very, very important. The Maldivian government under Abdulla Yameen has been having it very easy. They, you know, he has been able to actually bypass the constitution. He has been able to bypass all the safeguards for human rights protection, and he, and he hasn't been actually paying for that. So I think it is very important. I think it is important that individuals should be actually put on a sanction list, and also uh, you know it has to be linked to even really what China is doing. So if there are companies that are dealing with Chinese companies, and those companies are dealing with any of the Maldivians who are on the sanction list, then China could also be affected by that. So I mean, there has to be, I think, a regime of sanctions like that to be effective. So on the kind of sanctions that really relate to tourism, I've never, you probably know, David, my opinion on that. I've never actually agreed with that. I think it is very important for tourists to go. The more tourists go from the Western countries, the better it is going to be. China is never going to tell their tourists not to go unless there are, travel advisory services. So that is really what I can tell you about my opinion on sanctions. On the issue of the role that the United States is playing, uh, I think although there is a lot of rhetoric, against China, and of course, there were quite a lot of rhetoric against China when President Trump became president and so on. But there seems to be, I mean, and that is partly because probably China itself knows how to uh, handle certain issues. There seems to be some kind of, a dialogue also going on behind the scene, which sorts things out. Now, on what has been happening in the Maldives since the state of emergency, I would like to really pay tribute, great tribute, to Western diplomatic missions, which is, of course, it is an extension of the United States government, but I mean, they have been excellent. The U.S. ambassador, Mr. Keshop, has been really an excellent supporter of the movement in the Maldives for democracy and human rights. The uh, uh, UK High Commissioner in Sri Lanka has been very effective. All the other countries have been really good. So, I mean, Western countries have been actually very good. Japan has been very weak, and that is, something that all the other governments should actually take note of, put pressure on Japan to understand that really this is a very serious situation. China must be encouraged to join the community of nations in a move to restore the supremacy of the constitution and the rule of law. Most importantly, it is very, very important that all these countries actually should um, try to ensure that the presidential elections that are due this year are held in a free and fair atmosphere.
Thank you, Abbas. I just want to bring in one final question from Hawa, who's asking, given the isolation and the unpopularity Yameen is facing that you've spelt out domestically for the steps he's taken and externally, the criticism he has faced, do you think there's an opportunity here for Nasheed to negotiate with China to pull back its support from Yameen?
Uh, I think it is very important that I mean exactly. Sorry, am I? Yeah. Okay. Um, what I said, and you're absolutely right. The state of emergency has actually is not going to um, help Yameen's likely dream of having his name entered in the Maldives constitution. I mean, Yameen, probably sees Xi Jinping as his hero, but I mean, China has got to actually understand the challenges against Yameen will continue. Internal and external pressure will endure, and this is not going to actually go away. I think China has two options in the Maldives. The first option is to come to the community of nations, other community of nations, and say, look, what can we all do to sort things out? So that is really the most logical, and I would imagine, personally, I think that is how China will actually function in this situation. The other option, which is less likely, is to prop up Yameen. If China does that, China will actually single itself out as the sole supporter of Yameen. And that is, it would be by default, China will become the political supporter of Yemen. And China is not going to be able to do that because that would be, I mean, there are just so many factors that that will not allow China to do that, because first of all, the area is just too strategically sensitive for China to be the sole backer of a dictator in the country. At the same time, Yamin is very unpredictable. He's also, okay, a strong man groomed by China, but quite unpredictable, and China will not want to really put all its eggs in one basket there. And there are just so many other issues. I think what will happen eventually is that China and other nations will sit at a table and work something out. In a situation like that, as I say, I mean, I don't know what the priorities of former President Nasheed is. Of course, he will decide what to do. But I do feel that this entire issue is an issue of external negotiation.
Thank you, Abbas. Unfortunately, we're out of time now, so I wanted to thank you so much for your, contributions, and to our listeners as well. I hope I was able to do justice to the questions that you had. So thank you for joining us for this interesting discussion. On your screens, you'll see information on upcoming webinars. But from us at Chatham House, let me take the opportunity to say thank you and goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.